Well, I grew up in an academic environment, and I also grew up in an environment of academic parents who had left Germany after Hitler came to power. And there was a considerable emigration of professors after April of 1933, and again in particular after the so-called Kristallnacht, Crystal Night of November 1938. And my father belonged to that group of academic refugees who was dismissed from his university position in Berlin when Hitler's regime passed its first edict that dismissed civil servants, and all professors were civil servants because it was a state system of universities, dismissed all civil servants who were politically unreliable or who were Jewish. My father was not Jewish, but he was certainly politically unreliable, and my mother was Jewish by ethnicity. And they saw very clearly what was going to be happening in Germany. At that time, you could leave Germany. In fact, the regime was very anxious to have as many politically unreliable and Jewish people leave Germany as possible. A couple of years later, the regulations became still more stringent, but by then my family had left. So I grew up in a household that was not only academic, but European. It was a German household in which children were brought up very strictly, and a German household in which at the same time the children were taught to be independent, were expected to do their schoolwork and to do well in school. Education was the greatest priority that the refugee families had for their children, I think. And at the same time were taught to be responsible and to look after themselves, to read what they wished, to be able to roam around and find things out on their own. And my parents loved America. They loved the freedom. They loved the greater informality. They loved the academic world, which was entirely new to them, so different from the German, but one that they liked. But they did not like American popular culture, and they did not want us exposed to American popular culture. And so we were not allowed to listen to the radio, for example. And we were not allowed to eat a lot of stuff that they thought was sort of barbarian, like white bread, Wonder Bread, and things like that, which they thought would make us quite decadent.
Eat Wonder Bread. You want to grow bigger and stronger, don't you?
Golly!
And we were not allowed to go to the movies and things like that, except very carefully chosen ones like Fantasia, the Disney movie that has classical themes as its inspiration. We were allowed to listen to three things on the radio on Sundays. One was the New York Philharmonic. The second was the NBC Symphony of the Air, conducted by Arturo Toscanini. And the third, and this is perhaps relevant to our conversation, was the University of Chicago Round Table of the Air.
Over NBC's coast-to-coast network of independent and affiliated stations, the University of Chicago Round Table,
which featured various people talking about important issues.
But they don't want that to be coupled with political and social domination. Would you agree to that?
Oh, certainly. Financial imperialism is the word that's often used in the Southeast Asia, even about Americans, or particularly about Americans. They don't want aid on those...
The university at that time had an office of radio, and it was one way in which the University of Chicago was known, among others. And certainly it's the first time I knew anything about the University of Chicago, so I always thought of it as a very high-minded intellectual institution which had the Round Table of the Air. They discussed issues of culture, issues of politics, issues of international affairs that were becoming more and more of concern to Americans at the time. So growing up in the household that I did not think I would wish to be an academic, because everyone I knew was an academic. My grandparents were academics, my parents were academics, and it was the last thing I was going to be or do. It was a little unusual, I think, in those days for children to be quite so much exposed to classical music and to classical literature and so on. And so we were a little different probably in that way. And I myself feel that growing up in that kind of background was, in the end, a form of great richness for me, that is, to have both European and American culture, and to feel that they were, to some degree, integrated in a new way in my own life, although I certainly discovered that I was American, and discovered that particularly when I went abroad to study after I graduated from college.